started Exodus today and trying to be mindful of a few backdrops as I read through this text. So backdrop number one, just keep this in mind. Genesis chapter 43, verse 32 says, the Egyptians who ate with Joseph sat at their own table because Egyptians despise Hebrews and refuse to eat with them. That's one backdrop to keep in mind. Second backdrop to keep in mind, chapter 46, verse 34, that says the Egyptians despise shepherds. Third backdrop to keep in mind is in chapter 47 as they are running out of food. Verse 16, since your money is gone, bring me your livestock. I will give you food in exchange for your livestock. So they brought their livestock to Joseph in exchange for food, in exchange for their horses and flocks of sheep and goats, herds of cattle and donkeys. Joseph provided them with food for another year. And then what ends up happening is they are out of things to sell. So they sell their own bodies to Pharaoh and he begins this 20% tax. So the beginning of Exodus tells us that another king rises up. This is chapter 1, verse 8. Eventually, a new king came to power in Egypt who neither knew Joseph nor about what he had done. First reality that sticks out to me is a king rises up in Egypt who doesn't even know Egyptian history. He hasn't likely researched the Egyptian history to even know how the size of that giant Egyptian government occurred. And it was because of Joseph. He said to his people, look, the people of Israel now outnumber us and are stronger than we are. So he begins the narrative, the belief that the Hebrews are stronger. But he says in verse 10, we must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. If we don't, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us. Then they will escape from the country and fight. Well, wait a second. Why? Whoa. A lot of ifs there and a lot of assumptions. But this king who rises up doesn't know history, doesn't know that one of these people, Joseph, is one of the people that helped create his power. He basically says we have to do something about them growing. Verse 11, so the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. Now wait a second. Did you notice verse 9 says they outnumber us and are stronger than we are? But they outnumber us and are stronger than we are. How did they make them slaves? Well, the reality is to say they're stronger than we are is creating the narrative, creating the propaganda that incites fear, that makes people believe we have to do something about these people. Verse 12, the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread. Listen, and the more alarmed the Egyptians became. Why were they alarmed? Well, because they were believing a narrative that ultimately the king of Egypt had created. He had created this idea that they're more than us, they're stronger than us. If we don't do something about them, then ultimately they're going to turn against us when it comes to war. Well, what? Like, first of all, there's got to be a war. Second of all, they have to turn against you. Third of all, if you're a loyal king to them, why wouldn't they be loyal to you? That wasn't the thought. The thought was, we need to enslave them. And so the Bible then says, verse 13, the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and do all the work in the fields. They were ruthless in all of their demands. The next thing that Pharaoh does is he tries to take out the males. And he goes to the Hebrew midwives and he tells them, if it's a boy, kill him. This was the Egyptian version of birth control, abortion, Planned Parenthood. Their version of that was, if it's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let her live. The Hebrew women even take part in somewhat of this narrative of folk belief, unbeknownst to them, and they're doing it really to save lives. But they say the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They're more vigorous and have their babies so quickly we cannot get there in time. Whether they were telling the truth or not is less relevant than what I don't think they recognized is they were actually taking part in the narrative that they're stronger than us and they're more vigorous than us. And so what does Pharaoh do next? What does the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, do? Verse 22, he gave this order to all his people: throw every newborn Hebrew boy into the Nile River, but you can let the girls live. So just like Jesus, I see a lot of, Moses and Jesus ultimately, because Jesus comes after. But again, we can see even here that there's a desire to kill all of the young Hebrew boys. And so Moses in chapter 2 is born. And when Moses is born, his mom goes and puts him by the riverbank. And the princess, Pharaoh's daughter, comes to the riverbank. And when she comes to the riverbank, one of her attendants finds this baby. And what is amazing to me is verse 10 of chapter 2 says, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. Now, I want you to get this in your mind's eye. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, has ordered all Hebrew boys to be killed. Pharaoh's own daughter disobeys this command, and not only disobeys it, but adopts this Hebrew boy. So Pharaoh now, who has commanded that all the Hebrew boys die, now has an adopted Hebrew grandchild. This is where the narrative of Scripture really helps us navigate even where we are in America today. Think that through. Pharaoh has enslaved Israelites. Pharaoh has made a decree that all of the young boys should die. Pharaoh has commanded the Hebrew midwives to kill every Hebrew boy, and now he has a Hebrew boy as an adopted grandson in his own house. I just wonder how that adopted grandson was treated. When Moses grows up, he goes out to visit his own people. That's verse 11 of chapter 2. That means he knew that he was a Hebrew. I wonder how he knew that. I don't know, because the text doesn't tell us. But certainly we know that he was a Hebrew. And so he sees an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. And he looks every which way, and then he kills that Egyptian and puts him in the sand. Well, what ends up happening is the next day he goes out, he sees two Hebrews fighting, and he says, hey, don't do that. They say, hey, what are you going to do? Kill us like that Egyptian? And watch this. Watch what happens. Moses was afraid, thinking, everyone knows what I did. And sure enough, this is verse 15 in chapter 2, Pharaoh heard what had happened, and he tried to kill Moses. This is the adopted granddad to Moses. Here's what happens, and he goes to kill Moses. Question: if this adoptive granddaddy who made a decree, remember those backdrops I gave you, he's made the decree that all the Israelite boys die. His own daughter has disobeyed this and brought a Hebrew boy into his own home, palace, government, whatever, however you want to say it. Moses knows he's a Hebrew. So when Pharaoh hears about what Moses has done, Pharaoh tries to kill him. It immediately makes me think, man, I wonder what Moses had to hear as a child being a Hebrew. It makes me think, man, what were the types of things he heard around or heard his adoptive grandfather say about the Hebrews? Moses runs away and he goes to Midian, and he helps some girls who are having an issue with shepherds. And when the girls return home, I'm interested by this. Verse 19 of chapter 2, an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. Moses wasn't an Egyptian, but he had an Egyptian name. And I don't know, but maybe what Pharaoh's daughter, maybe even what Pharaoh, the grandfather, tried to do, the adoptive grandfather tried to do, was make him look a little bit more Egyptian. And so he could pass for being an Egyptian. I tell people all the time, race is a new construct, about 300 years old, if that. But ethnocentrism has always been the case. I mean, and when I say always been the case, since the fall, there has always been a division in people groups and the way those people groups operate together. And so the simple part of this, because I'm going to have to do chapter 3 on its own, because there's just a lot in chapter 3, and chapter 4 goes with it. But I'll end with this today. Verse 23 of the end of chapter 2, years passed, the king of Egypt died. That would be Moses' adoptive grandfather. But the Israelites continued to groan under the burden of slavery. They cried out for help, and their cry rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He looked down on the people of Israel and knew it was time to act. Again, just because I'm a Christian doesn't mean I like reading stuff like this. This is really frustrating to me. Now, I know that God told Abraham when he made the covenant promise that his descendants would be strangers in a strange land for 400 years. I get that. What's really frustrating as I look at this is it seems like God forgot about his people. Now, I know it's not true, but it seems like it. And as a black man in America, I have certainly felt that way. Like, man, God, what are you doing? Like, how did you forget? Like, why did you go to sleep at the wheel? How did you allow this to happen? The encouragement the Lord continues to give me, even as I look at a text like this, is he sees, he hears, and he acts. God does not let any injustice go. And he proved it by killing his son. And so anytime I want to be frustrated, anytime I want to say, oh, God's not paying attention, God's heart was breaking in watching his own people suffer. And yet he allowed that suffering. He allowed the suffering of his own son, that we can never look at him and say, when our kids are suffering, we can never say, God, you don't know what this is like. When my son Judah is suffering with seizures, as his seizures have picked back up here and there, I can't look at God and go, you don't know what this is like. I can't look at God and go, this isn't fair. You wouldn't do this to your own son, because he did. And he did it to his own children, his own people. And that would make some people go, man, how can he say he's love? How can he say he's loving people like this? That just doesn't make any sense. And I wrestle with that a lot of times. And then I remember as a dad, because I love my kids, I sometimes let them go through some really hard things. No, I don't enslave them, and I don't want them to be enslaved. But I think that as I read the scriptures, I'm just continually convicted that it's not my view of God that needs to change, it's my view of love that needs to change. Because I think love is just this very happy, always give people what they want kind of feeling, when love is actually an action that wants what's best for another person, that brings them to the deepest, most intimate, most satisfying truth of who God is and who they are. What we believe about God is the most significant thing about us, because it will determine what we believe about ourselves and what we believe about everybody else. I hope that blesses you today. I hope that you're encouraged to know that you're not the only one wrestling or struggling as you look at the scriptures. I hope that you know, even though I'm a proclaimer of God's word, I'm a Christian camp director, this is what I do. This is who I am, but it doesn't mean I read the scriptures and I'm always happy about it or like what I'm reading. So hope that you're encouraged. I just want you to know that I love you. Hope you have a great day. Peace.